On our third wedding anniversary, my husband Felix brought his first love to our doorstep. Wendy was tricked by a scumbag and got pregnant. She's all alone with no one to rely on. I plan to have a fake divorce with you first, then marry Wendy to give her unborn child a legitimate status, so the baby won't be laughed at as illegitimate from birth. Georgia lowered her gaze to her own slightly more prominent belly compared to Wendy's pregnancy, then nodded calmly. Okay. Felix immediately handed over a divorce agreement. Georgia took it, glancing at him. The divorce agreement had been prepared early on, clearly not for discussion but merely to inform her. Georgia flipped through it casually, her fingers pausing slightly when she caught sight of the phrase "the wife leaves with nothing." Felix coughed lightly beside her, awkwardly explaining. Wendy said since it's just a fake divorce anyway, we can remarry directly after her child is born. That way we avoid the hassle of dividing assets. Then he added, "You're not angry, are you?" Georgia shook her head, lowered her lashes, and calmly signed her name. Felix was surprised by her promptness, his voice unusually gentle. "Georgia, I know you have nowhere to go. You can stay in this villa for now. Don't worry, we'll remarry in a year." Georgia silently handed him the signed divorce agreement. She had no intention of remarrying. Beside her, Wendy grabbed the divorce agreement and then clung to Felix's arm, cooing, "We have a prenatal checkup scheduled today, and it's almost time. Let's hurry." Felix nodded, holding Wendy's hand as they left. Wendy turned back to glance at Georgia, her eyes filled with smugness and provocation. Only after the two had disappeared from sight did Georgia call her doctor directly, changing her scheduled prenatal checkup to an abortion procedure. "Hello, everyone, welcome to my channel. Subscribe us to read wonderful novels every day." Now the story begins. She drove to the hospital and arrived at about the same time as Felix and Wendy did. They entered the hospital one after another. Felix sympathized with Wendy for the hardships of pregnancy, placing a hand around her waist to support her. Wendy naturally leaned into his embrace, and the two walked intimately into the maternity ward together. Georgia took a glance, then calmly walked towards the operating room. The surgery was completed quickly. Georgia lay pale and still in the recovery room, waiting for the postoperative observation period to end. She picked up her phone and noticed several missed calls. Just as she was about to call back, the other party called again. "Ms. Georgia, you have a dinner reservation at 7 p.m. tonight. Will you be arriving on time?" Georgia suddenly remembered that she had reserved a restaurant in advance, planning to have a meal with Felix to celebrate their third wedding anniversary. But this plan was disrupted by Felix bringing Wendy to her doorstep. Now, might as well celebrate her divorce then. Georgia pursed her lips and said softly, "Yeah." After 2 hours of observation at the hospital, the doctor finally allowed her to leave. Her lower abdomen ached slightly, but Georgia didn't feel particularly bad, more like a sense of relief. After graduating, Georgia joined the Osmond family's secretarial department. She worked diligently for a year, but when her mother was diagnosed with brain cancer, even after selling their old family home, the medical expenses still weren't enough. Georgia knelt before Osmond family's chairman, Felix's father Harley Osmond, begging for an advance on 5 years' salary to cover her mother's medical expenses. Harley took in her desperate situation, scrutinizing her from head to toe in an instant. Under the man's heavy gaze, Georgia felt uneasy, expecting nothing but rejection and a decision to fire her. Yet after a moment of silence, Harley spoke. The Osmond family would cover all her mother's medical expenses, but in return, she must marry Harley's son Felix. Georgia only later found out that Felix had proposed to his first love, Wendy, but she said she wasn't ready to settle down and accused Felix of trying to tie her down with marriage. She acted as if Felix had scared her and immediately left the country. Felix drowned his sorrows in alcohol after that, sinking into despair day after day. Harley wanted Georgia to marry Felix to help him recover. Harley not only covered her mother's medical expenses but also hired the best neurologist to treat her. Although her mother eventually passed away, at least she had no regrets in her heart. Georgia was grateful to Harley and thus repaid this gratitude by extending it to Felix. Harley arranged for her to become Felix's personal secretary. Georgia worked even harder, pretending to be infatuated with Felix and pursued him relentlessly for a full year, until one time, while negotiating a business deal, Georgia drank on behalf of Felix until she suffered a stomach hemorrhage, passed out, and was hospitalized. Felix was deeply moved and, after she woke up, tearfully proposed to her. Others mocked her, but she paid no mind. After marriage, she devoted herself wholeheartedly to Felix. Originally, their relationship gradually warmed, no less than that of an ordinary couple, and she even became pregnant with Felix's child, but just a month ago. Felix's first love Wendy suddenly returned to the country. Georgia snapped out of her memories and found herself already in the restaurant parking lot. After parking her car, she carried her bag upstairs. Just as she reached the restaurant entrance, she spotted Felix and Wendy. Their table also included several of Felix's close friends. The group happened to be dining there and hadn't noticed Georgia's presence. They were currently discussing Georgia and Felix's divorce. Felix's good buddy joked, "Felix, did you and your wife really divorce? She loves you so much. Would she agree to a fake divorce like this?" Felix tossed the divorce agreement onto the table without much concern. "It's just for a year. She's always been understanding." His buddy flipped through the divorce agreement and clicked his tongue. "Isn't her understanding a bit too much? I remember she's pregnant too, right? Could this just be a delaying tactic until the cooling-off period ends and she changes her mind?" Felix's expression turned colder. "She wouldn't dare." Felix, another brother, noticed Wendy looking displeased and nudged the person in front, reminding them, "All right, stop mentioning Georgia. She was just a secretary who climbed her way up. Originally our Felix's admirer, always doing whatever Felix said. Now, Wendy is our sister-in-law." The person quickly responded, "Yes, yes, hello, sister-in-law." Wendy finally softened her expression, showing a slight smile. Others watched as Felix stood by, serving her tea and water, and joked, "Felix, since you and Georgia are already divorced, why not make it real and just be with Wendy? Everyone knows you've never let go of Wendy all these years." Wendy blushed with shyness upon hearing this and looked at Felix with anticipation. Felix simply gazed at Wendy in his arms with a light chuckle, neither agreeing nor refusing. Georgia curled her lips into a mocking smile. "The divorce papers haven't even been signed yet, and you're already rushing out with your mistress to flaunt your new status." Georgia walked past them with an indifferent expression, following the waiter to her reserved private room. Waiters came and went, serving the dishes she had ordered earlier one by one, until a figure stopped in front of her. Georgia assumed it was a waiter and looked up in confusion. "What's wrong?" When she saw clearly who was standing before her, she couldn't hide her surprise. Patrick. Patrick wore a casual black suit, standing lazily while looking down at her from his superior position. His light chestnut eyes concealed a cold and indifferent ferocity, his entire demeanor exuding an unrestrained air of aloof arrogance. His voice was cold and deep. "Alone? Mind if I join you for dinner?" As he spoke, he casually extinguished the cigarette but between his fingers on the bone china plate, pulled out a chair, and sat down beside her without giving her any chance to refuse. Georgia became visibly uneasy. If Felix could be considered among the top tier of wealthy heirs, then Patrick was the very pinnacle of that elite circle. The Sampson family flourished in both business and politics, and as a scion of this century-old dynasty, he was jokingly referred to as the Crown Prince. The Osmond family also relied on the Sampson family for some collaborative ventures to make ends meet. Felix invited him to gatherings, and out of 10 invitations, he might accept once or twice. Georgia, since following Felix, I've attended a few of their gatherings over the years and have crossed paths with Patrick several times. Each time he arrived, he didn't engage much, just sat quietly in a corner, creating his own little world. His demeanor was aloof, yet his presence was so strong it couldn't be ignored. Felix and his group could go wild and rowdy, but he never said a word about it. Georgia almost developed the illusion that this man had a gentle temperament, until one time, a man insinuated that she had slept her way to the top, proposing a deal to Felix in exchange for sleeping with her. Felix hadn't even uttered a word when Patrick grabbed an ashtray and smashed the man's head open. The man was beaten until his head was covered in blood. Passing out on the spot, wiping his hands calmly, he casually tossed out 2 words, "Trash." Georgia certainly wasn't narcissistic enough to think he stood up for her sake. She simply assumed he disapproved of the man's behavior. Still, she stammered out a thank you to Patrick. The man glanced at her briefly, gave a low and turned to leave. Georgia updated her impression of him, a bit short-tempered, but a good person. Given their barely existent relationship that couldn't even be considered a nodding acquaintance, there was really no reason for Patrick to come mooch this meal off her. Before her, the man's jade-white fingertips had already picked up chopsticks, casually helping himself to a piece of spare rib as if he'd genuinely come for a free meal. Georgia clenched her fingers, racking her brains for how to act naturally. When suddenly she met Patrick's light-colored eyes, then she heard him say, "I heard you got divorced. Congratulations. Felix helped his mistress take your place. Maybe you should consider finding a male counterpart to get back at him." "I'm single." 28 years old, 193 centimeters tall, with no bad habits, let alone any childhood sweethearts, first loves, or any of that nonsense, just missing a wife. How about marrying me to get back at him? Georgia's eyes slowly widened in disbelief as she stared at him. Did he really need to go to such lengths to find a wife? Not that she was putting herself down, but really, how could she possibly deserve this? As their eyes met, his gaze was too sharp. Georgia couldn't withstand it and awkwardly averted her eyes. Her gaze swept over his hand holding the chopsticks. Noticing his knuckles had turned white from the force, Georgia suddenly realized it was because he was nervous. Never expected he would be nervous. This realization actually made her feel less tense. Georgia hesitated before asking, "Aren't you and Felix friends?" Patrick said with a cold gaze and an icy tone. "Is he even worthy?" Indeed. Given the Osmond family's status, they are still far beneath the Sampson family. Georgia paused before mustering the courage to tentatively ask, "Can I choose to refuse?" Patrick tightened his grip on the chopsticks, staring at her expressionlessly. The man's aura was overwhelmingly strong. Just a single glance from him made Georgia feel a shiver of fear. Her lower abdomen still ached at that moment. Perhaps because the man had once helped her. Georgia didn't brush him off but instead looked at him earnestly. "Mr. Patrick, I endured a loveless marriage for 3 years and finally broke free. Though I don't know why you chose me, it certainly wasn't out of affection. I don't want to." Before she could finish, she heard the man speak in a slow, deep tone. "How do you know it's not love?" Georgia felt a jolt in her chest, momentarily speechless, her cheeks flushing belatedly. Patrick leaned slightly closer, his pleasant voice resonating by her ear with an irresistible dominance. "You can consider it until the day you and Felix get your divorce certificate. Let's eat first. You don't look well." The meal passed tastelessly. Georgia noticed as she walked out that Felix and the others were still there. She slightly furrowed her brows, not wanting to be seen with Patrick, lest it cause unnecessary misunderstandings. Her steps unconsciously quickened. Patrick noticed her hurried pace, the corner of his lips curling as he subtly increased his speed without a word. Felix and the others glanced in their direction, only to see Patrick walking leisurely behind a woman. From their vantage point, they could only catch glimpses of the woman's snow-white calves, faintly visible beneath her long skirt with each step, an alluring sight. The two were standing quite close. Patrick was practically pressed against the woman's back, looking as if he had her wrapped in his arms. The posture seemed somewhat intimate. Wendy frowned. "That woman, she looks like Georgia." Felix denied it without hesitation. "Impossible." Felix's friend immediately chimed in. "Exactly. Patrick is that kind of person. How could he possibly be with Georgia? Let alone that intimately. Besides, Georgia is just Felix's die-hard simp. She's probably at home crying her heart out right now. No way she'd come out to a restaurant for dinner." Felix heard this, and a hint of pride instantly flashed in his eyes. Remembering Georgia's obedient demeanor when signing the divorce papers, he took out his phone and transferred $1 million to Georgia. Sending a condescending message, "I have to take care of Wendy during this time and won't be able to come home. Since you're pregnant, buy yourself some nourishing food to take care of your health." As she reached the doorway, Georgia saw the message and felt a mix of emotions. After more than 3 years of marriage, Georgia had not been without feelings for Felix. However, these feelings were Wendy gradually exhausted after she returned to her home country. Now there is only numbness left, along with a faint disgust towards his heartlessness and lack of self-awareness. So, he still remembered she was pregnant. After 3 years of marriage, Felix had never transferred her any money. Now that they were divorced, he suddenly remembered to send her money. Georgia didn't reply to his message, but she accepted the money. After all, the abortion had taken a real toll on her body. After the abortion, she needed to rest in bed for a few days. Georgia took leave directly and stayed at home for several days. During this rare leisure time, Georgia was lounging on the balcony sofa, basking in the sun, when her phone suddenly rang. As soon as she answered, her ex-mother-in-law's harsh words burst out. "Get back to the old house right now." Without waiting for Georgia to respond, she hung up the phone directly. Georgia paused for a moment, probably guessing what it was about, then got up, changed clothes, and drove to the Osmond family's old house. As soon as the door opened, the scene in the hall rushed into view. Felix was kneeling on the ground, while Harley held a whip, lashing it repeatedly against Felix's back. After who knows how many strikes, Felix's back was now streaked with bloody welts. His face was pale, yet he still straightened his spine, stubbornly refusing to yield. Wendy stood by, crying uncontrollably, while her mother-in-law stomped her feet in anger. continuously pleading with Harley, "Stop hitting him, Felix is your only son, how can you beat him like this for the sake of an outsider? If you keep going, something terrible will happen, and you'll regret it." Harley seethed with rage. "It'd be best if he died. Harley, have no son as irresponsible as you. Go apologize to Georgia immediately and withdraw the divorce application." The mother-in-law, overwhelmed with anger and tears, rushed forward and grabbed Harley's whip-wielding hand, wailing, "If you want to kill my son, you'll have to kill me first. That Georgia is just a secretary with no background. How could she possibly be worthy of our Felix? They should have divorced long ago. Felix and Wendy were meant to be together. Childhood sweethearts, first loves. Wendy's family background matches ours, and she's the only daughter-in-law I'll accept. Not to mention, Wendy is already carrying our Osmond family's grandson in her womb. Felix, clever and devoted to Wendy, took the blame and claimed the child as his own." Georgia couldn't help but laugh inwardly as she watched her mother-in-law so staunchly defending Wendy and Felix. If she knew Felix was just a stepfather, that this child had nothing to do with the Osmond family, would she still defend them so fiercely? Wendy sobbed as she threw herself onto Felix. "Mr. Harley, please stop hitting him. If you must hit someone, hit me instead. It's my fault. Don't blame Felix anymore." Felix knelt on the ground, his face resolute. "Dad, you can beat me to death if you want, but I can't stand by and watch Wendy raise this child alone and helpless. I have to give her child a proper identity." Harley shook off her mother-in-law, watching the group's obstinate demeanor with such fury that veins throbbed visibly at her temples. He slammed the whip in his hand onto the ground and pointed at Wendy, shouting, "She's pregnant. Her child needs legitimacy. But what about Georgia? Georgia was pregnant a whole month earlier. That child is the true flesh and blood of our Osmond family." Felix wore an expression of unwavering determination. "Georgia and I have already agreed. Once Wendy's child is born, I will remarry Georgia. Regardless of whether her child was born during our marriage, it is still a member of the Osmond family." Harley looked at him as if he were a fool, her voice dripping with exasperation. "Felix, do you even understand your own wife's temperament? How could I have raised such a foolish son?" Felix's sharply defined, handsome profile came into her view. Georgia felt somewhat dazed. Scenes of warmth and sweetness with Felix floated through her mind, gradually fading into monochrome fragments. Her mother-in-law caught sight of her standing not far away and rushed over in a panic, pushing her forward forcefully. "What are you still standing here for, you troublemaker? Are you just going to watch Felix get beaten because of you? Hurry up and go stop them." She was very strong. Georgia lost her balance, and her lower abdomen hit the armrest of the chair directly. A surge of warmth flowed beneath her. Georgia turned pale with pain and instinctively bent over. The mother-in-law quickly withdrew her hand, looking disgusted as she said, "I didn't use much force. Don't you dare try to frame me." Harley frowned and looked at Georgia with concern. "Are you okay? Is everything all right? The baby in your belly?" Georgia shook her head, her face still pale. "I'm fine, Mr. Harley, let's talk." Harley looked at her pale yet calm face and sighed helplessly. "Come with me to the study." Felix knelt on the ground, watching as Georgia, her face pale, followed Harley into the study. He instinctively waited for Georgia to rush over and plead for him, yet from the moment she entered, she didn't say a single word to him. Seeing him get beaten, yet not showing the slightest concern, Felix frowned, feeling an inexplicable discomfort in his heart. Georgia, why isn't she concerned about him anymore? Wasn't she the one who loved him the most? Or is she playing hard to get, acting cold on purpose, waiting for me to comfort her? Georgia and Harley entered the study. Neither the mother-in-law nor Felix knew about their agreement back then. Both thought Georgia genuinely liked Felix and was using the opportunity to climb the social ladder. In reality, back then, Harley had Georgia marry Felix to repay a debt of gratitude. Besides demanding that she treat Felix with utmost care and devotion, Harley also made one additional request. In her marriage with Felix, the one who could initiate a divorce had to be Felix. Georgia has always been the weaker party in this marriage. Lacking autonomy from the very beginning, Harley ensured his son's absolute interests from the start, and now, Felix unintentionally returned her freedom. Hearing Georgia say Mr. Harley, Harley immediately understood her stance. Harley wanted to persuade her further. "Georgia, you've been with Felix for 3 years, and we've all seen how good you've been to him." Felix was just confused for a moment. Back then, he liked Wendy, but Wendy dumped him. Now he's just feeling a bit unwilling to let go. Once he sees clearly, Georgia cut him off directly, her tone this time even more distant and polite. "Mr. Lou, Felix has been deeply devoted to Ms. Wendy for years. And now his feelings are finally being returned. That's not necessarily a bad thing. As Mrs. Osmond said, they were always meant to be together. It wouldn't be right for me to stand in their way and become an obstacle to their love. She directly took out her resignation letter and a bank card from her bag and placed them on the desk in front of him. I've divorced Felix, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to continue working for the Osmond family. This is my resignation. As for this card, it contains the money you provided for my mother's surgery back then. No matter what, I'm truly grateful for your help at that time. Harley frowned as he looked at the resignation letter and bank card on the table. Even if you're divorced from Felix, you don't have to draw such a clear line with the Osmond family you're carrying. As he spoke, his gaze fell on Georgia's abdomen. Georgia smiled faintly. Don't worry, Mr. Liu, I won't bother Felix anymore. I've already had the baby aborted. Harley abruptly looked up at her. Georgia's expression was calm, but the stubborn determination in her eyes was just like when she knelt before him years ago, begging him to save her mother. Harley remained silent for a long time before sighing. He'll regret it. Georgia left the Osmond family's old mansion calmly. Whether Felix would regret it or not no longer concerned her. All she wanted now was to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. Earlier, Mrs. Osmond's push had caused her lower abdomen to collide with something, and she could feel the warm flow beneath her continuing relentlessly. A sense of foreboding welled up in her heart by the time she finally returned to the car. Beads of sweat had already formed on her temples, and her hands trembled slightly as she drove. Just as she drove the car out of the villa area, Georgia was forced to pull over to the side of the road. Her vision darkened in waves. Georgia lowered her gaze to her legs. Blood had already seeped out, soaking her skirt. It was clearly a severe hemorrhage. Georgia trembled as she pulled out her phone. Felix's number happened to be the first on the list, and he was also the closest. In this life-or-death moment, Georgia didn't bother to distance herself and quickly dialed his number. Before long, Felix answered the call. Georgia felt a chill on her forehead. Felix, I'm not feeling well. Could you take me to the hospital? My car is parked just outside the villa area. Felix instinctively grew concerned and said urgently, I'll be right there. However, as soon as he finished speaking, Wendy beside him said with a pained expression, Felix, my stomach hurts so much. I don't know if it's because I cried too hard earlier and disturbed the baby. Felix was stunned, and Mrs. Osmond urged anxiously beside him, What are you hesitating for? Quickly take Wendy to the hospital. Georgia heard Felix hesitating on the other end, but he still said, Georgia, I'll take Wendy to the hospital first. Wait for me. I'll come pick you up after I've taken her. With that, the call was abruptly hung up. Georgia leaned back in the chair, listening to the busy tone on the phone, a bitter smile appearing on her face. Wait, she was afraid she wouldn't be able to wait for him. The blood from her lower body kept flowing. Georgia tried to call 120 for emergency help. When suddenly the car window was knocked, Georgia turned her head in surprise. Felix, however, the person standing outside the car was Patrick. The man was dressed in a black casual shirt, his expression cold and stern. Hearing her call out Felix's name, his face darkened instantly. He raised his hand and tapped the car window impatiently again. Why are you parked on the side? Car trouble. Georgia then remembered that he seemed to own a villa in the same neighborhood as the Osmond family's old estate. Georgia, trembling, rolled down the car window, her eyes reddening, voice choked with sobs. Patrick was taken aback. Why are you crying? I wasn't scolding you. The next moment, he saw the large swath of crimson between her legs, and as the car window opened, the pungent smell of blood assaulted his nostrils. His expression changed abruptly as he hurriedly pulled open the car door, leaned in to unbuckle the seatbelt, and gathered Georgia into his arms. Georgia's consciousness began to fade, her ears filled with the man's steady heartbeat and his soothing voice. Don't be afraid. Patrick carried her back into the car and barked at the driver, to the hospital. The car sped away. Not far away, Felix was driving, but his gaze couldn't help lingering on Patrick's car as it gradually disappeared into the distance. Why did he just see Patrick carry a woman out of that car by the roadside? That woman. Why did she look so much like Georgia, losing too much blood? Even though she was tightly embraced by the man, Georgia still felt extremely cold, acutely aware of her life force slipping away. Georgia nestled into Patrick's arms and couldn't hold back her tears. Patrick, am I going to die? Patrick gritted his teeth, his voice cold yet fierce. You haven't agreed to marry me yet. What's this talk of dying? Without my say, even the king of hell wouldn't dare take you. Georgia let out a faint laugh, looking at the worry hidden beneath his cold expression, and whispered softly, then I promise you, If I survive this, I'll marry you." After speaking, her voice grew fainter and fainter until she fell unconscious. Patrick panicked, "Georgia, Georgia." But Georgia could no longer answer him. Patrick yelled at the driver, "Drive faster." The driver's expression turned serious as he immediately floored the accelerator. Patrick tightened his embrace around Georgia in his arms, lowered his head to kiss her cold forehead, and murmured, "I won't let anything happen to you, you'll be fine." The car quickly arrived at the hospital. Patrick carried Georgia and rushed inside. The hospital had already received his call and was prepared, immediately sending Georgia into the operating room. Bags of blood from the blood bank were continuously sent into the operating room. Patrick paced furiously outside the operating room, his face filled with rage, and when he looked up, he saw Felix and Wendy not far away. Felix was restless, repeatedly dialing Georgia's number, but no one ever answered. This had never happened before. Normally, it was always Georgia who called him first, and he would decide whether to answer based on his mood. A shadow suddenly fell before his eyes. Felix looked up and met Patrick's gaze. The gaze was extremely sinister, even exuding an almost undisguised, chilling murderous intent, as if in the next second, it would transform into a beast tearing them apart. At a glance, Patrick was covered in blood, his entire demeanor appearing utterly terrifying. Felix and Wendy were utterly unnerved by his gaze. Wendy was so frightened that she instinctively let out a cry and hid behind Felix. Felix shielded Wendy and said somewhat reluctantly, "Mr. Patrick, what a coincidence to see you at the hospital. Are you injured?" Patrick narrowed his eyes as he watched his instinctive gesture of protecting Wendy, then slowly said, "Are you planning to divorce Georgia and marry this woman?" Felix replied awkwardly, "Why, yes, Wendy is pregnant. I need to give the child in her womb a proper identity." Patrick said coldly, "Your divorce cooling-off period is over. Go get the divorce certificate tomorrow." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the two bewildered individuals behind. Wendy quickly beamed with joy and said, "Oh, Felix, this Mr. Patrick seems tough to talk to, but he's actually quite nice, isn't he? Maybe he took pity on me because I'm pregnant and wanted us to get married sooner." Felix felt a pang of uncertainty in his heart. Patrick, since when did he care about such things? He lowered his gaze to his phone. Over 40 calls had been made, but Georgia hadn't answered a single one. This was the first time in all these years. Could it really be playing hard to get? Felix felt a surge of anger and sent another message. "Georgia, are you deliberately not answering my calls? Didn't you say you weren't angry? Why are you acting so jealous now? Ignoring my calls won't help. The divorce papers can be picked up tomorrow. If you cooperate, I might even agree to remarry you sooner." The message was sent but met with complete silence. Georgia was critically ill multiple times, and Patrick waited outside the operating room, signing countless blood-stained critical condition notices. After a long and arduous rescue effort, she was finally out of danger and transferred to a general ward early the next morning. Georgia, when she woke up, her right hand was tightly held by someone. Patrick's beautiful phoenix eyes were bloodshot, clearly from staying up all night. He was staring intently at her, his emotions as dense as a net, tightly ensnaring her within. Recalling the peril before losing consciousness, she felt a lingering fear. If he hadn't brought her to the hospital in time, she might not have made it this time. Seeing her finally open her eyes, he immediately stood up and moved closer. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" This was the first time since her parents passed away that Georgia experienced the feeling of being cared for, cherished, and worried about by someone. Tears gradually welled up in her eyes. Patrick saw her tears and his expression changed anxiously. "What's wrong? Are you in pain somewhere?" He reached out and pressed the call button several times in a somewhat impatient manner. Georgia smiled through her tears. "I just really want to marry you." Patrick paused for a moment, then leaned down, his voice hoarse. "Then let's get our marriage certificate today." "Okay." Georgia looked slightly embarrassed. "I'm still in the divorce cooling-off period." Patrick curved the corners of his lips slightly. Doctors and nurses rushed over due to the call bell, carefully examining Georgia and confirming that there were no major issues left. Patrick looked at the doctor. "Is there any danger in leaving the hospital for an hour today?" The doctor said with some hesitation. "Ms. Georgia needs rest, but if it's just for an hour, as long as she takes it easy, there shouldn't be any problems." Georgia was puzzled, but Patrick showed no intention of explaining. It wasn't until the afternoon that Georgia was carried into the car by him. The car drove forward until it stopped in front of the Civil Affairs Bureau. Outside the car, Felix and Wendy walked out of the Civil Affairs Bureau hand in hand. They came just to give it a try, never expecting to actually receive their divorce certificates. At Wendy's suggestion, the two decided to go ahead and get their marriage certificates as well. Now, Wendy held her phone, and together with Felix, they took several photos holding their marriage certificates, editing a social media post with the caption, "After all the twists and turns, I've finally returned to the right person." Just as the post went up, a large hand reached over and took one of the two divorce certificates from Felix's hand. Felix looked up, saw it was Patrick, and smiled gratefully. "Mr. Patrick, thanks to you, I've already obtained the divorce certificate and also got the marriage certificate with Wendy." Patrick pocketed the divorce certificate and said indifferently, "No need to thank me." Felix was stunned. "Mr. Patrick, this is the divorce certificate between me and Georgia. I need to keep this copy for her." Patrick glanced at him. "No need, I'll deliver it for you." After speaking, he turned around, opened the car door, and carried Georgia out. The intimate gesture was just like what Felix had seen on the roadside the day before. Watching the affectionate display between the two and glancing at the large sign reading Civil Affairs Bureau, a faint suspicion arose in his heart, and his face gradually paled. Felix's body began to tremble uncontrollably, his voice shaking along with it. "Georgia, what are you and Mr. Patrick doing at the Civil Affairs Bureau?" Georgia, still somewhat weak, leaned against Patrick's chest and looked at Felix as if he were a fool. "Coming to the Civil Affairs Bureau, of course, is to get married." The Felix lips trembled as he asked, "Marriage? Who are you marrying?" This time, Georgia couldn't even muster a reply. Patrick embraced her and teased Felix, "Your eyesight really is poor. Such a big man standing right here, and you still couldn't see me." His gaze swept past Felix to Wendy standing beside him. Wendy felt his gaze and instinctively tugged at her skirt, then smoothed her hair. Patrick smirked faintly. "What a grand white lotus. Yet you can't even see it." Wendy darkened instantly, her expression wounded as she protested coyly, "Mr. Patrick, we've no grudges between us. How could you say such a thing about me?" Patrick curved the corner of his lips. "Miss Wendy is my great benefactor. How could there be no grudges between us?" Wendy brightened up, both surprised and curious. "When did I ever do you a favor?" Patrick was astounded by her foolishness. "If you hadn't pried away Felix, that piece of trash, how would I have had the chance to marry my wife?" This time, Felix and Wendy both darkened their expressions simultaneously. Georgia looked up at Patrick and couldn't resist teasing, "Your words are so venomous. Could a kiss from you be fatal?" Patrick wrapped his arm around her waist, his voice hoarse. "Want to give it a try?" Georgia flushed slightly and obediently fell silent. Nearby, Felix could no longer stand it and pulled Wendy, who was blocking the way, aside. He stepped forward, his gaze burning as he looked at Georgia. "Georgia, you're my wife. How could you register a marriage with Patrick?" Glanced at the Wendy beside me. He frowned and said, "Are you angry about me marrying Wendy? I've already explained to you that getting the certificate with her was just to give her unborn child an identity. She's just a young girl, pregnant and so pitiful. I was only helping her. Are you really this jealous, this unable to tolerate her?" Georgia had thought she wouldn't be affected by this person anymore. But she forgot that disgust is also an emotion. She never knew that Felix was such a terrible person, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Her body trembled slightly with anger. Georgia's eyes were icy cold. "Felix, I may be petty and jealous, unable to tolerate my husband abandoning me to care for another woman. That's why I divorced you. From now on, our marriages are none of each other's business. You've successfully married your long-cherished first love. So who I marry has nothing to do with you. What right do you have to be angry and question me?" Felix turned red with urgency. "That's not how it was. We agreed my marriage with Wendy would only last a year, and then I'd remarry you." Georgia let out a cold laugh. "I never agreed to remarry you." Felix suddenly remembered that back then, Georgia had simply said okay upon learning he was divorcing her to marry Wendy. She never once mentioned remarrying him throughout the entire ordeal. She never had any intention of remarrying him at all. Georgia looked up at Patrick and tugged at his sleeve. "Let's go." The two turned to enter. Felix hurried forward and grabbed Georgia's arm. "Georgia, I know you're only agreeing to marry Patrick because you're angry with me, but marriage isn't a game. I'll give you one more chance. If you turn and leave now, I won't hold this against you. If you marry Patrick, even if you divorce him and beg me to take you back, I'll never forgive you." Georgia simply replied calmly, "So you do know that marriage isn't a game." Felix was instantly speechless, flustered as he tried to explain. Beside them, Patrick grew impatient and abruptly kicked Felix in the chest, sending him stumbling back. Felix was kicked to the ground and fell, Wendy screamed and rushed over to help him up. Felix, are you okay? Patrick patted the spot on Felix's arm where he had just grabbed Georgia, his face full of disdain, looking down from above. He glared contemptuously at Felix. If you dare to lay a hand on my wife again, a single kick will be the least of your worries. Felix, his chest aching and his face pale with pain, roared, Patrick, a friend's wife is not to be trifled with. Just because your Samson family has power and influence, does that give you the right to bully others and steal someone else's wife? Patrick took the divorce certificate out of his pocket and held it up in front of him. Tell me, who is your wife? Felix stared at the words divorce certificate, and his raging anger instantly fizzled out. He then turned to look at Georgia and pleaded, Georgia, I was wrong. I really know I was wrong. Whatever it is, let's talk it over properly as husband and wife. Don't act out of anger. If you're really unhappy, I can just go apply for a divorce with Wendy, and then remarry you. Please don't act impulsively. He put on a reluctant expression. As if Georgia and Patrick getting married was just to force him to divorce Wendy. Perhaps it was because she had been too good and indulgent to him in the past, making him think she loved him so much that she had no bottom line and would tolerate whatever he did, which emboldened him to make such outrageous demands. Unfortunately, even the deepest affection can be exhausted one day, not to mention, her love for him hadn't even had a chance to sprout before he uprooted it completely. Georgia couldn't hide her disappointment as she looked at him. Felix, you're really too self-righteous. After speaking, she directly took Patrick's hand and walked toward the civil affairs office. Felix panicked, watching her gradually receding figure. Feeling an uncontrollable panic in his chest, he urgently called out behind her, Georgia, Georgia, you can't marry him, you're my wife. Georgia, pushing away Wendy who was supporting him, he rushed forward trying to grab Georgia. However, Patrick was prepared. With just a glance, his bodyguards immediately stepped forward to restrain Felix, pinning him to the ground. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't get even half a step closer to Georgia, until the figures of Georgia and Patrick disappeared from sight. Wendy hurried over to help Felix up. She stomped her foot in anger. Georgia is going too far. I bet she's been secretly involved with Patrick all along, which is why she agreed to the divorce so readily. Now she's even playing the victim. She's the one who's been unfaithful. Wendy intended to provoke Georgia, but to her surprise, Felix turned pale and snapped, shut up. He simply couldn't accept the fact that Georgia no longer loved him. Felix frowned and said with conviction, Georgia loves me so much. She's been devoted to me all these years. How could she possibly go behind my back to seduce Patrick? He was so anxious that he kept pacing in circles. Although I don't know how she managed to get Patrick to agree to play along with this act to show me, she must be doing it out of spite. It's impossible for her to just stop loving me like that. Wendy pursed her lips and remained silent, her face showing a hint of feigned concern. As a woman herself, Georgia's actions were completely understandable to her. What woman could easily forgive being served divorce papers by her husband while pregnant? Though envious that Georgia had left Felix and found someone better in Patrick, she secretly felt even more smug. Georgia and Felix were now completely over, which meant no one would compete with her for Felix anymore. Wendy's smugness didn't last long before Felix's gaze suddenly fixed on her. Wendy felt a chill run down her spine under his gaze and stammered, Felix, what's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that? Come with me. Felix grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the civil affairs office. Divorce? We're getting divorced right now. We must do it before Georgia and Patrick get their marriage license. Wendy turned pale with shock and frantically showed her phone to Felix. Felix, I just posted on my social media. Everyone knows we're married now. If we divorce right away, what will people think of me? Felix frowned. Everyone already knows it was a fake marriage to begin with. I only pitted you and gave your unborn child a legal identity. There's nothing for them to laugh about if we divorce. As he spoke, he was already dragging Wendy to the entrance of the Civil Affairs Bureau. He looked around inside but didn't see Georgia or Patrick anywhere. Felix grew increasingly panicked and urged, hurry up, Georgia and Patrick will be done with their registration soon. No, I won't get divorced. Wendy struggled, desperately trying to walk away. Felix looked extremely grim. Wendy, this isn't up to you to decide. As he spoke, he dragged the person to the divorce counter, pushing others aside and pulling Wendy to the front. I want a divorce. Felix and Wendy were relatively good-looking, having just obtained their marriage certificate and taken numerous photos inside the civil affairs office. The staff were quite familiar with them. Seeing the two return in less than half an hour clamoring for a divorce, the staff's expressions immediately darkened. The staff member pointed at Felix and Wendy, then gestured to the long queue behind them, speaking sharply, "Sir, I just saw you and your wife receive your marriage certificate. Has it even had time to warm up? And now you want a divorce? Marriage isn't child's play, and the Civil Affairs Office isn't a place for playing house. Can you think things through before acting?" Wendy hurriedly waved her hands. "No, we're not getting divorced." Felix grabbed her collar angrily. "Wendy, are you insane? My wife is Georgia. I helped you, and this is how you repay me." She clung to Felix's arm, crying desperately, "Felix, please. You really can't leave. Do you have to be so cruel to me? You know I can't forget you. Didn't you promise me that even if we couldn't be together for a lifetime, you'd still be my husband for a year?" Wendy was crying pitifully. Felix looked at her and couldn't help but soften a little, hesitating momentarily. A staff member reminded them, "Excuse me, could you two step aside? There's a long line of people behind you waiting." Divorces now require advance appointments and a 30-day cooling-off period. Wendy pulled Felix away while sobbing. Felix felt upset and turned his head, only to see Georgia and Patrick walking out side by side from the marriage registration office. Both of them held a red booklet in their hands. Smiling, Felix rushed over in disbelief, reaching out to snatch the marriage certificate, but Patrick was quick to react, immediately tucking it away into his pocket. When he looked at Felix again, his gaze was icy and his aura imposing. "Felix, do you think I'm giving you face? How dare you try to snatch my marriage certificate?" Felix turned excitedly to Georgia and said, "Georgia, you deliberately got this marriage certificate to upset me, didn't you? It's fake, right?" Georgia sneered. "Making fake IDs is illegal." With that, she directly took Patrick's hand and walked out. Felix reached out to grab her, but Patrick calmly stepped forward, placing himself between Georgia and him, shielding Georgia from behind. Felix gritted his teeth, glaring at Patrick resentfully. "Mr. Patrick, I advise you not to push your luck." Patrick sneered, his gaze sinister as he looked at him. With just one glance, Felix couldn't help but take 2 steps back. His heart was filled with terror. How could he have forgotten that this cold-faced judge of the underworld was never known for his good temper? Patrick's family background was something his Osmond family couldn't afford to provoke. Patrick only turned around after seeing him stop, then followed behind Georgia, shielding her as they both got into the car. Georgia glanced at Felix outside the car before turning her head away. The car window was slightly open. Felix stood in place, only able to see Georgia's profile, which carried a coldness he had never seen before. But soon, she slightly raised her head, her gaze resting on Patrick's face. The coldness on her face instantly softened by tenderness, leaving only a gentle smile. Felix's heart pounded violently. His entire body instantly seized by panic. He instinctively clutched his chest, feeling only an unbearable tightness in his heart. He had originally thought Georgia was just acting out of spite, but at this moment, an intense unease in his heart frantically signaled that he was losing her. The car drove away. Inside the car, Georgia and Patrick sat together. Georgia opened her palm, the marriage certificate. Patrick wore a guarded expression, his hand instinctively resting on the pocket containing the marriage certificate. "You're not seriously thinking of reconciling with Felix, are you?" Georgia chuckled lightly. "Would you agree to that?" Patrick cooled his expression. "Impossible." Georgia leaned in and directly retrieved the marriage certificate from his pocket. The unique fragrance of a woman drew near, then slightly receded. Patrick had a subtle change in expression, his eyes darkening momentarily. Georgia didn't notice the shift in Patrick's gaze beside her as she opened the marriage certificate, her eyes settling on their joint photo. Her complexion was poor. Patrick had specifically arranged for light makeup to be applied. In the photo, she wore a faint smile, while beside her, Patrick, who usually maintained an icy, aloof demeanor of extreme arrogance, was unusually sporting a radiant smile. "It seems like he genuinely has some feelings for me." Georgia turned to look at him. "Patrick, you." The words were on the tip of her tongue, but she felt too embarrassed to ask directly, so she changed it to, "Aren't you going to sign a prenuptial agreement with me?" Patrick's beautiful phoenix eyes showed a hint of confusion. "What prenuptial agreement?" Georgia suddenly thought of this matter and said seriously, "Before Felix and I got married, he had a prenuptial agreement notarized, and we signed a prenup stating that his premarital assets had nothing to do with me. When we divorced, apart from the $1 million he gave me a few days ago, I didn't take any of his assets. The rest of the money was earned through my work over the years." In Georgia's view, Felix's assets couldn't even compare to Patrick's. The Osmond family had to guard against her assets, and with Patrick's wealth, he would likely be even more cautious about these matters. She also had no intention of seeking wealth through marriage. Holding the marriage certificate, she spoke with sincerity and composure. Although we've already registered our marriage, you can prepare a prenuptial agreement. I'll sign it, Georgia. As the words fell, Patrick fixed her with a deep, unreadable gaze. The man's intimidating aura alone was frightening. When those cold, fierce eyes remained silent, just staring, it always made people feel somewhat apprehensive. Though they'd registered their marriage, truth be told, the two weren't particularly familiar with each other. She suddenly felt a bit awkward. Did I say something wrong? Patrick suddenly wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her into his embrace in one swift motion. Suddenly enveloped by the man's cool pine scent, Georgia blushed and struggled to break free. Patrick spoke in a cold, slightly hoarse voice. Don't move. Georgia immediately froze, not daring to move. Patrick softened his tone when he saw her with slightly lowered lashes. Looking aggrieved, he raised his hand, cupping Georgia's petite face, no larger than his palm, and looked at her earnestly. Georgia, I'll only say this once, so listen carefully. As my wife, for every dollar I earn, 50 cents is yours. Earning money to support my wife is my duty, and spending my money is your rightful privilege. The man's tone was deadly serious. Georgia's lashes fluttered slightly, her eyes brimming with disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Being with Felix for 3 years, Felix had never spoken to her like this. Although Felix didn't openly guard against her, that 1 million was only remembered to be given after the divorce. Not to mention Felix's mother always treated her like a thief, convinced she was a mistress who climbed her way up, targeting the Osmond family's assets, terrified she'd spend even Felix's single penny. Georgia was stubborn at heart, unwilling to be looked down upon, and spent only from her own salary. This was the first time someone had said that earning money to support her was a matter of course. Her eyes slightly reddened. Patrick moved closer. Likewise, it's time for you to fulfill your marital duties, Georgia asked in confusion. What marital duties? Patrick chuckled. For example, kissing me. No sooner had he finished speaking than his cool lips pressed against hers, and as their breaths mingled, the kiss instantly turned scorching, igniting the atmosphere in the car to a fever pitch. Until Georgia let out a soft moan and melted into his embrace, Patrick's voice was strained, almost gritting his teeth. If you weren't still in the hospital, I wouldn't let you off so easily today. Georgia flushed crimson, nestling in his arms with a light laugh. Too embarrassed to respond, the driver in the front seat struggled to keep his hands from trembling, maintaining a blank expression as he drove, with only one thought in mind: I shouldn't be in the car, I should be under it. Georgia was sent back to the hospital to recuperate for several days before she could be discharged. During this time, Felix tried every possible way to contact her through messages and calls. Georgia simply blocked all his contact methods and never responded to any of his messages again. After divorcing Felix, it was no longer appropriate to live in their previous marital home, especially since Patrick had already prepared a house, waiting for her to move in. After being discharged from the hospital, she went straight back to the villa where she had previously lived. As soon as she opened the door, she saw Wendy sitting leisurely on the sofa, exuding the air of a mistress of the house. Meanwhile, Felix's mother, Mrs. Osmond, was sipping tea while issuing orders. This will soon be Wendy and Felix's marital home. Clean it up properly, and throw all that junk out to the doorstep later. Several bags of luggage were haphazardly piled in the hall. Georgia walked over and took a look. They were all her belongings. Her face turned pale with anger as she glared coldly at Wendy and Mrs. Osmond, demanding, "These are my things. What right do you have to dispose of them as you please?" Mrs. Osmond slammed the teacup down heavily. "Ha, you used to act so respectful in front of me. Now that you're divorced, you've dropped the act. You've finally shown your true colors. This is my son's house, and of course I have every right to deal with the things inside. You came just in time. Hurry up and take away this pile of junk, or I'll burn it all." In the past, Georgia had genuinely regarded her as family, believing that if she did well enough over time, she would eventually let go of her prejudices. But she never expected that some people's prejudices are like an insurmountable mountain, impossible to overcome. Wendy deliberately placed a hand on her stomach as she stood up, walked over to Georgia's luggage, gave it a light kick with her foot, and then said with a look of disdain, "Miss Georgia, you and Felix are already divorced, and you've remarried, yet you still haven't moved your luggage out of the villa. Could it be that you're hoping to rekindle an old flame with Felix?" Mrs. Osmond's expression darkened. "She's dreaming. My son would never marry her again, that vixen. She can forget about ever stepping foot into my Osmond family's home again." She pointed at Georgia's luggage. This place will soon be the marital home of my son and Wendy. Why don't you do the sensible thing and clear out? Are you moving it or not? If you don't, I'll have someone burn it all. With that, she turned to the household staff. What are you standing around for? Go deal with it now. Georgia stepped forward. Get out of the way. I'll move it myself. As soon as she finished speaking, the door was pushed open. Felix strode in quickly. Georgia. I heard you were back, you. He hurried through the door, and his gaze was instantly drawn to the large pile of luggage in the hall, immediately furrowing his brows. What's going on here? Before Georgia could speak, Mrs. Osmond said, what else could it be? You're already divorced. What does this house have to do with her? She's been lingering here refusing to leave, so I came personally to drive her out. Felix suddenly changed his expression and angrily said, Mom. How could you treat Georgia like this? This house is the marital home for Georgia and me. Her belongings can stay here as long as she wants, and no one has the right to touch them. After speaking, he hurriedly explained to Georgia, Georgia, I'm sorry. I didn't know they would do this. I'll have someone put everything back right away, and I'll also transfer the house under your name. Mrs. Osmond and Wendy were instantly furious upon hearing this. Mrs. Osmond slammed the coffee table, stood up angrily, and pointed at Felix, shouting, have you lost your mind? She's just a secretary, someone not even fit to be seen in public. You're already divorced. Why should the house be transferred to her? Besides, you and Wendy are married now. And Wendy is even carrying your child. How do you think Wendy would feel if you gave the house to your ex-wife Georgia? Felix frowned and instinctively began to say, the child in her belly isn't, before she could finish. Wendy rushed over in a panic, grabbing his arm and shouting, Felix, lowering her voice, her eyes filled with pleading. She said, Felix, you promised to keep my secret. If you say it out loud, how can I ever face anyone again? I might as well die. As she spoke, she released Felix and fell to her knees with a thud, her head about to knock against the coffee table. Mrs. Osmond was so startled that she quickly bent down to pull her up. Wendy, what are you doing? You're pregnant. You can't handle this kind of stress. With a ferocious expression, she glared at Georgia and said, Georgia, you troublemaker, if anything happens to my grandchild, I won't let you get away with it. Kneeling on the ground, Wendy suddenly clutched her abdomen and screamed, my stomach, it hurts so much. As she collapsed to the ground, wailing, Felix instinctively shielded her. Wendy took the chance to lean into his arms, clinging tightly to him as she sobbed, Felix, it hurts so much. Felix was instantly flustered, quickly picking her up from the ground and hurrying outside. Mrs. Osmond followed closely behind him in haste. Upon reaching the doorway, Felix halted abruptly, turning back with a face full of anxiety to look at Georgia. Georgia, I'll take her to the hospital first. Wait for me, I'll be right back. Georgia had anticipated this turn of events from the start. With a hint of mockery at the corner of her lips, she looked at him, remaining silent throughout. Felix wanted to say more, but the Wendy in his arms kept screaming in pain. Mrs. Osmond urged anxiously, what are you waiting for? Hurry to the hospital. Felix had no choice but to rush out, only leaving behind a sentence, Georgia, you must wait for me, wait for me. Georgia turned a deaf ear, bending down to look at the luggage piled on the floor. There weren't many important things. Georgia couldn't bear to part with only the photos she took with her parents in her early years. I dug out the photo album from a pile of luggage when someone suddenly walked in through the door. Georgia looked up and locked eyes with Patrick. He had personally escorted Georgia here, but just as they reached the door, he happened to receive a work call. So he let Georgia enter first to unpack. Earlier, outside the door, he saw Felix, Wendy, and Mrs. Osmond hurriedly leaving. Sensing something was wrong, he immediately rushed over. At this moment, seeing the mess all over the floor, Patrick, his eyes turned cold. What happened? Originally, the absurdity in his heart outweighed the anger, but now, meeting Patrick's gaze, perhaps knowing someone cared, those belated feelings of grievance and embarrassment began to spread. Georgia briefly explained what had happened. Patrick's cold and fierce gaze spread uncontrollably as he glanced at the servants in the villa, who didn't dare meet his eyes and hastily averted their gaze. One of them reluctantly said, We had no choice. Georgia held Patrick's hand and shook her head. Forget it, they're just employees following orders. Patrick's expression softened slightly. You're just too easygoing. Georgia smiled faintly, having been in the workplace for so long. She simply understood the struggles of the working class. Just as she was about to bend down to pack her luggage, Patrick grabbed her hand and said, Stop, don't bother packing. I'll have someone come over to pack everything and bring it over, if anything is missing. We can just buy it later, Georgia nodded while holding a photo album in her arms and was the first to step inside. Patrick made a phone call, and several bodyguards rushed in. Patrick glanced around the villa with a faint trace of hostility in his eyes and said coldly, "Pack up my wife's belongings and take them back. As for the rest, smash everything." Yes, Georgia and Patrick returned to their pre-prepared marital home, a 3.5-story detached villa. Most of the furniture in the villa features a black, white, and gray color palette, with a minimalist and cool-toned decor style. It looks like a showroom straight out of a TV show. Georgia glanced for a moment but said nothing. Patrick directly pulled her into the study. Georgia looked at the wall of books in the study and was somewhat awed. Then Patrick bent down to open the desk drawer and pulled out a file folder, handing it to her. "Open it and take a look." Georgia, though puzzled, she obediently opened it. To her surprise, the folder contained several property deeds. Georgia, her heart skipped a beat as she flipped through them in disbelief, only to find her own name written on them. The one she opened happened to be the property deed for their marital home. "This villa alone is worth $100 million. She suddenly looked up at Patrick. Patrick smiled at her. "We got married in a hurry. And you didn't ask for anything, so I prepared these for you. These properties are all in great locations. I think you'll like them." As he spoke, he took out a card and handed it to her. "Take this card and use it. The password is your birthday. If you don't like the style of the house, feel free to remodel it to your liking. I haven't paid much attention to the exact amount of assets under my name, but if you're curious, I can have someone compile a report for you to review. I've had someone recalculate the wedding date, and it's set for 4.5 months from now. Preparations are already underway." Georgia unconsciously tightened her grip on the property deeds and bank cards in her hand. The man's gaze was extremely earnest. Unlike the cold and aloof demeanor he showed to others, when facing her, his eyes were always gentle, as if he possessed endless patience. Georgia had never experienced such intense emotions before. Her eyes slightly reddened, and she couldn't help but look up at him. "Patrick, why are you so good to me?" Patrick wrapped his arm around her waist and smiled lazily. "You're my wife. If I'm not good to you, who else should I be good to?" Georgia felt warmth in her heart but still shook her head. "You know that's not what I meant." In the brief encounters she had with Patrick, she truly couldn't understand why he had taken a liking to her, let alone treated her so well. Patrick chuckled, lowered his head, and placed a kiss on her lips. "I'll tell you at the wedding." Georgia nestled in his arms when her phone suddenly rang again. She looked down and saw it was a call from the Osmond family's villa servant. Georgia, no need to guess. It was obviously Felix borrowing the servant's phone to call, originally planning to hang up directly, but Georgia ultimately decided to make things clear with him. As soon as she answered the call, Felix on the other end urgently said, "Georgia, didn't I tell you to wait for me at home? Why did you leave? And what happened to the house?" His gaze swept over the house, finding it even messier than before he sent Wendy to the villa. The house was completely trashed and is now a veritable garbage dump. Felix took a deep breath and added, "It's fine. It's good for you to vent your anger rather than bottle it up and harm your health. Besides, we've lived in this house for several years, and the decor is outdated anyway. We can renovate it according to your preferences." His magnanimous and unconcerned demeanor only made Georgia find it amusing. "Felix, I'm not the same Georgia I used to be. No one will stay in the same place waiting for you forever, and no one will keep waiting for you at home all night. I've moved on, so please don't disturb me anymore." Felix choked up, as if he simply couldn't accept it. "But I clearly told you it was a fake divorce. Don't you love me? Why couldn't you wait just 1 year, and we could have remarried?" How laughable that even now he still had no clue where he went wrong. Georgia replied with calm indifference, "Felix, a fake divorce, you can lie to me, but how could you lie to yourself? The divorce certificate isn't fake, and neither is your inappropriate closeness with Wendy right now. It's your first love, your white moonlight Wendy, who's pitiful and has no one to rely on, so my child and I have to step aside once her child is born. Will you start worrying again about her being a single mother who might get bullied? My child and I will always just be your backup. I don't want to live like that for even one more day." The child. Felix grew frantic when Georgia mentioned the baby. "Georgia, don't forget, you're carrying my child. How could you marry Patrick with it? That's my baby." Georgia, word by word, "The child was aborted long ago." "What? Georgia, how could you be so heartless?" Felix was instantly enraged. "That was my child too. How dare you make this decision without even asking me? You decided to marry Wendy without even asking me, didn't you?" After saying that, Georgia immediately hung up the phone and blocked the number. Her fingers unconsciously rested on her flat abdomen. She had hesitated before, considering raising this child alone, but the Osmond family would never allow their bloodline to be left outside, compared to a lifetime of entanglement with the Osmond family. She would rather endure temporary pain, yet whenever it's mentioned, Georgia still can't help feeling somewhat sorrowful. However, before she could fully process her emotions, she was pulled into a warm embrace. Georgia immediately relaxed her body. She would have children again, and she believed that Patrick would be a good father. Georgia thought she had clarified things with Felix, but she didn't expect Felix to not believe her at all and to frantically search for her whereabouts. A few days later, he actually showed up at the home she shared with Patrick. The wedding was scheduled for 4 months later, with some arrangements needing to be finalized months in advance. As the couple was discussing the wedding details, the doorbell suddenly rang. The servant opened the door, and from outside came Felix's voice. "Georgia, Georgia." Georgia frowned and signaled the servant to shoo him away. "I have nothing to say to him." Beside her, Patrick slowly uttered a few words. Like a lingering ghost, with that, he simply lifted his chin and signaled, "Let him in." Seeing her puzzled expression, Patrick wrapped an arm around her shoulder and said, "To vent for you." Georgia didn't know what he was up to, but upon hearing this, she calmly sat back and continued flipping through the documents. Paying no further attention, Felix quickly rushed in from outside. Patrick owned too many assets. He had been searching everywhere these days for Georgia's residence, checking one property after another, but still couldn't find it. Finally, he tried looking under Georgia's name and found this one. When he saw Georgia's name on the property documents, Felix wore a bitter smile. Realizing how poorly he had acted before, Georgia had been married to him for so many years, yet he had never given her anything valuable. On the other hand, Patrick, who seemed cold and indifferent, had given Georgia a profound sense of security. Felix burst through the door and saw Georgia sitting on the sofa, his gaze falling on her flat stomach. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with anguish. "Georgia, did you really abort our child? How could you be so heartless?" He had already investigated these past few days and seen Georgia's medical records, but only now, upon seeing her abdomen, did he finally give up hope, and the date of her abortion was the same day she signed the divorce papers. She appeared so calm, yet was so ruthless behind the scenes, leaving him no chance at all. Felix, as the words fell, Patrick was the first to sneer. "Ruthless." With that, he waved his hand. 2 bodyguards understood and stepped forward, directly pinning Felix to the ground. Felix gritted his teeth and glared at Patrick. "What do you want?" Patrick threw out a single word: "Fight." As soon as the words fell, the bodyguards immediately took action, punching and kicking Felix. Felix was, after all, the heir of the Osmond family. Never expecting Patrick to be so domineering, he instinctively and awkwardly covered his head, yet still stubbornly stared at Georgia, hoping to catch even the slightest hint of concern on her face. But the Georgia who used to fret over his minor bumps and bruises now wore only indifference. His body ached terribly, but his heart hurt even more. Felix's eyes reddened as he stared at Georgia and said, "Georgia, do you really not care about me at all anymore?" As soon as the words left his mouth, Patrick stood up and immediately kicked him in the abdomen. "Ah!" Felix let out a scream, doubling over as he spat out a mouthful of blood. Patrick, still seething with anger, proceeded to kick him several more times in the abdomen. Felix writhed in pain, howling miserably, wishing he could just pass out. Instinctively, he clutched at his lower abdomen where Patrick had been kicking him. Patrick stepped on his face, looking down at him with a cold sneer. "Hurts, doesn't it? Then do you know how much pain Georgia endured when she had a miscarriage? Do you know how much she suffered when she nearly died from massive bleeding? Do you know how many critical condition notices the doctors made me sign? You married her but failed to cherish her. What right do you have to call her heartless?" As he spoke, he kicked Felix in the chest, sending him sprawling. Felix's pupils contracted as he rolled awkwardly on the ground, yet he stubbornly widened his eyes, staring intently at Georgia. "Why didn't you tell me?" Georgia replied calmly, "I did tell you, the day your father punished you with the family discipline." Felix was taken aback, suddenly remembering that day when Georgia had gone to the Osmond residence looking very pale, and Mrs. Osmond accidentally pushed her, causing her lower abdomen to hit the armrest of a chair. At the time, he had noticed that Georgia didn't look well, but he was too preoccupied with getting his father Harley to accept Wendy and didn't pay attention to Georgia. After all, whenever she was sick or uncomfortable, she handled it herself and never bothered him. So he felt justified in pretending not to notice, and that day, Georgia unusually called after leaving. saying she felt unwell and begged him to take her to the hospital. At the time, Wendy said she had a stomachache from fetal distress. And he was in a hurry to take Wendy, so he hung up on Georgia. Later, he and Wendy ran into Patrick at the hospital. Patrick suddenly mentioned that his marriage certificate had been issued earlier. At that time, Patrick was covered in blood, his entire demeanor radiating a fierce aura. So much blood. Was it all Georgia's? At that time, she nearly lost her life. How helpless, how terrified she must have been. And what was I doing? He was rejoicing, finally able to get the marriage certificate and marry Wendy sooner. Felix turned deathly pale, overwhelmed by a flood of remorse that crashed over him like a tidal wave. Trembling and choking back sobs, he stammered, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I truly didn't realize how serious it was for you." Georgia stared at his tears, momentarily stunned, before replying with eerie calm, "If it weren't for Patrick, I'd be dead. Do you really think we can pretend nothing happened, that we could ever go back?" Felix was thrown out of the villa. Torrential rain pelted against his cheeks, leaving him utterly disheveled and humiliated. As the villa's doors slammed shut, Felix sat motionless, staring blankly at the entrance. The streaks running down his face blurred the line between raindrops and tears of regret. Georgia glanced through the window at the pitiful figure drenched in the downpour, then shifted her focus back to the wedding arrangements, didn't give it another moment's attention. Much later, it was Wendy who drove over to take Felix away. Georgia heard he was badly injured, and because of getting caught in the rain, developed a fever that nearly turned into pneumonia. He was hospitalized for almost half a month before recovering. She was busy preparing for her wedding with Patrick, and after hearing all this, she just smiled and moved on, paying no further attention. The only consolation was that Felix didn't bother her again after this incident. As if he had truly let go, Patrick took her to meet his parents and other Sampson family relatives. Unlike Felix's mother's pickiness, Patrick's family treated her with great warmth, presenting her with valuable gifts on their first meeting, showing utmost courtesy. In the blink of an eye, several months passed, and the wedding was approaching. Patrick had the wedding dress, specially custom-made by an international bridal design master, rushed to completion and sent back to the country. Patrick specifically accompanied Georgia to try it on. Georgia, with the help of the staff, put on the wedding dress and then slowly walked up to Patrick. Patrick, who had been sitting on the sofa, looked up and was momentarily stunned at the sight of her in the wedding dress. The pristine white wedding gown enveloped Georgia's graceful figure as she walked. The skirt swayed like dancing waves, rippling with an ethereal charm. Seeing Patrick remain silent for so long, Georgia grew uneasy. "What's wrong? Doesn't it look good?" Patrick pulled her into his arms, gently nibbling her lips as he whispered softly, "Beautiful. So beautiful that if I weren't afraid of ruining it and delaying our wedding in 2 weeks, I'd want to take you right now." Georgia hurriedly pinched his waist, fearing he might say something even more outrageous. Patrick chuckled softly, standing behind her as they both gazed at their reflection in the mirror, the perfectly matched pair standing side by side, their eyes shimmering with light, until Georgia suddenly heard a familiar female voice, "Felix, what are you doing here?" Georgia froze, turning her head with Patrick just in time to see Wendy and Mrs. Osmond arriving at the entrance of the bridal shop. Wendy reached out to loop her arm through Felix's. Her belly was already very large, looking at least 7 or 8 months pregnant. Felix saw Georgia looking over and felt somewhat awkward, awkwardly avoiding Georgia's gaze. He clearly remembered the time of his wedding with Georgia, because Mrs. Osmond didn't like Georgia. The wedding was kept very simple. Even the wedding dress was just a simple style bought casually. He didn't even accompany her to try on wedding dresses. Georgia never complained about anything from start to finish, just silently prepared for everything and endured it all. And now, watching Georgia and Patrick together in their happiness, Felix was filled with regret. Why didn't I cherish it properly back then? During this time, he tried his best to restrain himself from disturbing Georgia, yet he couldn't help but keep tabs on everything about her. Patrick's marriage was a major event in their circle, with countless people discussing it behind the scenes, envying Georgia. Not to mention Patrick's grand gesture, he had already booked the most luxurious star-rated hotel early on, planning to make the wedding a grand affair, showcasing his adoration for her to the world. Even because he once didn't care about Georgia, many people didn't know Georgia used to be his wife. Felix, no matter which dinner party he attended, someone would always mention their names. Felix, embarrassed and regretful, pulled Georgia to leave immediately. "It's nothing, let's go quickly." However, Mrs. Osmond and Wendy had already spotted Georgia and Patrick. Mrs. Osmond pursed her lips, revealing a hint of mockery. "Isn't this Georgia? Has she climbed to a higher branch now? Felix frowned. Mom, stop talking nonsense, Mrs. Osmond sneered dismissively. How is this nonsense? After being dumped by you, she latched onto the Sampson family. Isn't this Georgia just climbing the social ladder? As she spoke, she even proactively called out to Patrick, saying, Patrick. As her former mother-in-law, I'll kindly remind you, this Georgia is just a money-grubbing woman who'll stop at nothing for wealth. You'd better kick her to the curb before marrying her, or else, in the end, it'll be the Sampson family that ends up humiliated. Patrick smiled. Is there even a single clear-headed person left in your Osmond family? How is it that you've all aged without gaining any wisdom, not even understanding that loose lips sink ships? Mrs. Osmond, her expression changed. Her face flushed with anger. What do you mean? Patrick cast a cold glance at her. My Patrick's wife. Who are you to criticize? Mrs. Osmond trembled with rage. Patrick, your Sampson family may be wealthier than my Osmond family, but I am still your elder. How dare you speak to me like this? Patrick exuded an overwhelming aura, his gaze icy to the extreme. Did buying bags all day rot your brain? Even your husband Harley isn't qualified to stand before me and lecture me. Who do you think you are? Meeting his icy gaze, Mrs. Osmond felt as if her throat had been squeezed, rendering her momentarily speechless. It suddenly dawned on her. Harley had once warned that no matter who you provoke, never mess with the Sampson family. Especially this Patrick, who was known for his eccentric and difficult temperament. Mrs. Osmond was instantly put on the spot, torn between not daring to continue provoking and unwilling to back down with soft words. Her face turned alternately pale and flushed, and in the end, she could only shoot Georgia a fierce glare. Standing nearby, Wendy, seeing her awkward and humiliated state, stepped forward and said, Mr. Patrick, my mother meant well with her reminder. Please don't take it to heart. After her gaze swept over Georgia's haute couture wedding dress, her eyes were also filled with envy, but on the surface, she still put on a weak and friendly demeanor. Georgia, you once called me mom after all. You know she's just cold on the outside but warm at heart, and her words may sound harsh. You wouldn't take it to heart, would you? Mrs. Osmond immediately looked at Wendy with deep emotion. You're so considerate. Georgia found it amusing inwardly. Her gaze swept over Wendy's abdomen, then Georgia turned to Patrick. Don't let such people ruin our mood, Patrick said to the staff. What are you standing around for? Get them out of here. He had booked the entire place specifically to avoid disturbances, but unexpectedly encountered Felix and his group. What terrible luck. As the staff went to drive them out, Mrs. Osmond was furious. Wendy looked at Felix and said coquettishly, Felix, after the baby is born, let's have a wedding ceremony too. I also want to marry you beautifully. Mrs. Osmond smiled as her anger faded, chiming in, I think that's a great idea. You're so pretty, you'd look even more stunning in a wedding dress. It's our Osmond family's fault for making you go through this without a proper wedding first. Wendy heard Mrs. Osmond's words and guiltily glanced at Felix, but still maintained a charming smile. Mom, don't say that. I'm more than happy to marry Felix and have his children. How could I feel wronged? Mrs. Osmond smiled even more approvingly. I always said you're the sweetest and most sensible. Unlike some people, Felix listening to the back and forth between the two, he felt increasingly embarrassed. Mrs. Osmond was not the first time to mock Georgia in front of him, but before, he always thought his mother was just sharp-tongued, yet it was for his own good. Yes, it was for his own good. But not for Georgia. It was his repeated feigned ignorance that pushed Georgia further and further away. He couldn't stay any longer. Enough. Have you said enough? Get out now. With that, he glanced at Georgia and Patrick, saying awkwardly, sorry. He turned and walked away quickly. Mrs. Osmond and Wendy changed expressions. Mrs. Osmond glared fiercely at Georgia before following. Meanwhile, Wendy deliberately pouted and said, Felix, I know you're focused on buying baby supplies for the child, but there's no need to be in such a hurry. Wait for me. She hurriedly caught up to Felix. They hadn't gone far when they saw Felix gazing dreamily in the direction of Georgia inside the bridal shop. Wendy felt a surge of unease and instinctively blocked Felix's view, asking, Felix, what are you looking at? Mrs. Osmond also said with a displeased expression, Felix, now Wendy is your wife. How can you look at other women in front of your wife? Felix looked seriously at Mrs. Osmond and said, Mom, since you also know that a husband shouldn't look at other women in front of his wife, why did you encourage me to be with Wendy in the first place? Mrs. Osmond was taken aback, then exclaimed loudly, how can that be the same? Felix persisted, how is it different? Just because Georgia doesn't have Wendy's family background. Mrs. Osmond sneered. Georgia and Wendy. How could they even compare? Felix felt a bitter ache in his heart. Word by word, he stared at Mrs. Osmond and demanded, couldn't they, ever since Georgia and I got together, whenever you felt unwell? Georgia was the first to worry and accompany you to the hospital, more proactive than me, your own son. When Dad had high blood pressure, she set alarms to remind him to take his medicine and scheduled regular checkups. You bullied her, making her do chores and cook with the servants every time she came home. After slaving over a full table of dishes, you wouldn't even let her sit at the table to eat, forcing her to stand and serve. In the dead of winter, you made her stand at the villa entrance for 3 hours to greet guests, yet she never complained once. Just because she comes from a humble background and has no parents to back her up, does she deserve to be humiliated and mistreated like this by you, Mrs.? Osmond turned pale, then flushed with anger. Finally, she snapped, Felix, I'm your mother. Are you really siding with Georgia to question me? Didn't you used to support me too? Now that she's married to Patrick, you come running to defend her and challenge me. Don't you think it's a little too late? Felix's eyes reddened. Yes, he clearly knew it was wrong. So why hadn't he realized it before? What's more, he had even indulged his mother's terrible behavior. At one point, he even agreed with his mother's views. Georgia comes from such an ordinary family. Marrying him would be reaching above her station. She had no parents, only herself left. So no matter how he treated her, she wouldn't leave. But she not only left, but also never wanted to return to him again. Yet he was so unwilling to let go. No matter how much he drank or smoked, he couldn't forget George's figure. Instead, her goodness became increasingly vivid in his heart. Felix grew more heartbroken the more he thought about it. He simply couldn't let go of Georgia. He looked up at Wendy standing before him, deeply realizing his own absurd folly, now bearing the identity of Wendy's husband. What could he possibly use to win back Georgia? At this thought, Felix's expression hardened, and his gaze toward Wendy turned cold. Let's go, we're getting a divorce. Wendy let out a shrill scream. Felix, I won't divorce. I'm your wife now. And I will be for the rest of my life. I'll never agree to a divorce. For the past few months, Felix has been in low spirits and was barely dragged out by Mrs. Osmond to accompany her shopping. She had been convinced that Felix had finally given up on Georgia. But little did she expect that even though Georgia was about to marry Patrick, Felix would run into her by chance and then ask for a divorce. Felix sneered. We agreed back then that it was just a fake marriage. Wendy clung to his arm desperately, tears streaming down her face. Felix, how can a marriage be real or fake? Once married, it's done. Please stop being unreasonable. Okay, didn't you propose to me back then, begging me to marry you? Can't I just stay faithfully by your side now? Mrs. Osmond stomped her foot in anger beside them. It's all because of that vixen Georgia. Felix, have you lost your mind? Wendy is about to give birth to your child, and you're talking about divorce now. Even if you do divorce, that fox Georgia has already latched onto Patrick. She wouldn't spare you a second glance. Felix shook his head firmly. No, Georgia isn't like that. She was just heartbroken by me, so she turned to Patrick. I know I was wrong now, and I'll treat her right from now on. She divorced me and married Patrick because I hurt her. Why can't she divorce Patrick and marry me again? A crazed, obsessive glint flashed in his eyes. With that, he grabbed Wendy's arm tightly. Let's go. Divorce. It's a must. Wendy hugged his arm, crying. No, Felix, no, I can't leave you. Felix's eyes held a warning. Wendy, we both know what's really going on. Don't push me to the edge. Wendy just clung to his arm, crying pitifully. Mrs. Osmond was pacing anxiously nearby. Felix, Wendy is so heavily pregnant. Must you break her heart right now? Calm down first. Wendy looked utterly pitiful, but Felix remained unmoved. Forcefully dragging her out, Wendy suddenly clutched her stomach, her face pale as she cried out in pain. It hurts. My stomach suddenly hurts so much. Felix snapped impatiently. Enough, this act again. How many times have you faked it? Wendy whispered weakly. Felix, this time it's real. My stomach hurts so much. Felix frowned and was about to speak when he saw Wendy bleeding between her legs. Mrs. Osmond turned pale with shock. There's blood. Oh my God, my eldest grandson, Felix. Take her to the hospital right away. To the hospital, now. Felix was momentarily stunned, but without hesitation, he picked up Wendy and quickly walked out. Wendy was soon taken to the hospital. Mrs. Osmond and Felix waited at the door. Mrs. Osmond had already called Harley to come over as well. Felix sat on the chair. Mrs. Osmond paced back and forth incessantly, murmuring prayers for the safety of mother and child. Harley had just stepped out of the elevator when Mrs. Osmond hurried toward him with reddened eyes, saying, "You're finally here." Felix and Wendy had a fight, and Wendy is hemorrhaging badly. Smack. Before she could finish, Harley raised his hand and slapped Mrs. Osmond across the face. Mrs. Osmond was stunned, covering her face as she stared at him in shock. Felix was also shocked by the slap and quickly stood up. "Dad, why did you suddenly hit Mom? What happened?" Mrs. Osmond covered her face and burst into tears. "Harley, tell me. What did I do wrong? How dare you hit me?" Harley was so angry that his chest heaved, and he pointed at Mrs. Osmond furiously. "How dare I hit you? Then you better explain to me properly. What stupid thing did you do to provoke the Sampson family?" Mrs. Osmond froze, her crying expression stiffening on her face. Harley was furious to the point of frenzy. The Sampson family outright announced the termination of their years-long collaboration with the Osmond family. Before the Sampson family could even take action, the Osmond family lost tens of billions in market value. I called the Sampson family to ask for the reason, and the Sampson family simply said it was because my wife, Harley, said something she shouldn't have. "Tell me, what exactly did you say?" Mrs. Osmond's expression instantly turned guilty. I just casually said a few things about Georgia, that's all. I was only trying to advise Patrick out of goodwill." "What kind of woman is Georgia anyway? She's no good. If he marries her, it's because he's been deceived. How was I to know that Patrick would hold such a grudge and go after our Osmond family like this for her sake? Has he gone mad?" Lou was originally uneasy too. But if Georgia had resented Felix's betrayal, she would have retaliated long ago. Why wait until now? So it turns out it was that vile mouth of Mrs. Osmond causing trouble again, when he finally snapped out of it. He immediately lunged forward, grabbing Mrs. Osmond and slapping her several more times. "You fool, my Osmond family has been utterly ruined by you. What kind of family is the Sampson family? Even if Patrick married a chicken or a dog, it wouldn't be your place to criticize. Who the hell do you think you are?" Mrs. Osmond was beaten into loud sobs, her hair disheveled, looking utterly pitiful. Seeing that Harley wasn't letting up, Mrs. Osmond had no choice but to hide behind Felix, crying in grievance. "Harley, after all these years of marriage, even if I said something wrong, how could you hit me? How could you treat me like this?" Harley gritted his teeth in fury. "Our son has been spoiled rotten by you. The company is in complete chaos because of you. I only regret not having killed you sooner." Felix was pushed forward by Mrs. Osmond as a shield. Harley missed hitting Mrs. Osmond several times, and his palm struck Felix's face instead. Felix was forced to endure several slaps, his cheeks turning red. Exhaustion filled his heart. "Dad, stop hitting. Even if you beat Mom to death, it won't help." Felix had barely finished speaking when the surgery light turned off. A nurse walked out holding a baby in her arms, a smile on her face. "Congratulations, the baby was born prematurely, but thanks to the timely arrival at the hospital, both mother and child are safe." After finishing her words, the nurse looked up at Felix and the others, her smile freezing as her expression turned subtly complex. Mrs. Osmond had no time to dwell on her frustration from being hit and eagerly stepped forward to embrace the child. "Come here, my precious grandson. Let me hold you." The moment her hands touched the baby in the nurse's arms and she saw the child clearly in the swaddle, she screamed in shock. "What is this? This isn't my grandson." Harley and Felix looked over and saw that the child in the nurse's arms was actually a Caucasian baby. Fearing she might be accused of mixing up the babies, the nurse quickly explained, "There's no mistake. This is indeed Wendy's newborn." Upon hearing this, Mrs. Osmond widened her eyes in shock, then suddenly stiffened, unable to catch her breath, and collapsed straight backward. Fortunately, being in the hospital, Mrs. Osmond received emergency medical attention and was revived. However, she was left with a slight facial distortion and persistent twitching on one side of her face. Upon waking up and seeing Felix and Harley sitting in the hospital room, Mrs. Osmond hurriedly reached out to grab Felix's arm. "You, explain clearly. What's going on? Why does that wretched woman's child have a different skin color?" Harley had already heard Felix's explanation earlier and now let out a cold laugh. Sitting silently to the side, Felix lowered his head and sighed. "Wendy's child isn't mine." Mrs. Osmond looked at him in disbelief. "You knew all along." Felix nodded. "She told me she was tricked into getting pregnant. Her health was poor, and if she had an abortion, it would be very difficult for her to conceive again in the future, so she wanted to keep the baby." Mrs. Osmond struggled to prop herself up slightly and looked at Felix. "So, you knew the child in her belly wasn't yours, yet you lied to us and even divorced Georgia for her." Felix lowered his head. At the time, I just wanted to give the child in her belly an identity. If the child was registered under my name, at least she wouldn't be looked down upon by others. Georgia is my wife. Once I remarried her later, everything could go back to the way it was. But he never expected that Georgia would never want him again. Mrs. Osmond could no longer hold back and lunged forward, slapping Felix across the cheek. She screamed like a madwoman. How could I have given birth to such a foolish son? Are you out of your mind? You divorced your own wife for a woman carrying another man's child. So it turns out Georgia is the one carrying my Osmond family's heir. She struggled to her feet, grabbing Felix and dragging him toward the door. You cut ties with that wretched Wendy immediately. Go now. Hurry and beg Georgia for forgiveness. Bring her back. I was wrong. I'll never scold her again. I'll apologize properly and beg her to return. My precious grandchild. She's the one carrying my precious grandchild. Foolish. You're so foolish. As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly realized something was wrong. Georgia got pregnant earlier than Wendy, yet her figure looks much better than Wendy's. The wedding dress fits her so perfectly, showing no signs of pregnancy at all. Even if she had given birth early, it wouldn't be possible for her to recover this quickly, right? The thought had just crossed her mind when Felix said painfully beside her, She had a miscarriage months ago. Mrs. Osmond suddenly turned her head, staring at him with a deathly glare, her face turning livid as her expression twisted into something ferocious. Her body convulsed as she tried to speak, but no words would come out. She gasped hoarsely, like an old bellows. Unable to form clear syllables, only her eyes, filled with bitter resentment, remained fixed on Felix. Felix watched her trembling form in alarm and urged, Mom, don't get worked up. The doctor said you can't handle stress. Calm down first. But how could Mrs. Osmond possibly calm down now? Felix hurriedly pressed the call button. Having just regained consciousness moments ago, Mrs. Osmond was rushed back into emergency care, however, suffering consecutive strokes in such a short time. She wasn't so fortunate this time. Now completely bedridden, she couldn't get up at all, and even her speech became slurred and unclear. Upon waking again, Mrs. Osmond lay in bed weeping continuously. Felix stood guard by the bedside. Filled with guilt and vexation, Harley looked utterly exhausted, his hair now streaked with white. Seeing his wife in such a state, though he still resented her foolish indulgence, a pang of desolation struck his heart. Mrs. Osmond trembled all over. As if she had something to say, Felix leaned closer and barely heard her struggle to utter a few words. Mom, wrong. It was wrong. Go. Bring Georgia back. Felix's eyes lit up. Mrs. Osmond's eyes were filled with regret, 1,000 regrets. Had she known earlier Felix would be so foolish as to become an unwitting father to someone else's child, and that she would treat Wendy's illegitimate baby as her precious grandson, causing her own real grandson to be lost. She would never have treated Georgia this way. Mrs. Osmond trembled as she reached out her hand, pointing at Harley. Felix snapped back to reality, realizing Mrs. Osmond's implication. Eagerly, he began to speak. Dad, you used to be so good to Georgia, and she always respected you the most. Could you go and persuade Georgia to give me another chance? I truly know I was wrong. I don't love Wendy. The one I love is her. We were together for 3 years, and she loved me so much before. No matter what I said, she always agreed. I can't believe she's really let me go just like this. Harley met his son's tearful gaze and sighed. Son, don't even say it. Not only is it impossible for Patrick to let her go, but even if Patrick were willing to step aside, you and Georgia still wouldn't have a chance. Felix asked in confusion. Why? Even Mrs. Osmond looked at him curiously. She had always been curious. Georgia was just a secretary by background. Yet Harley had always held Georgia in extremely high regard. Why was that? Harley pulled up a document on his phone and handed it to Felix. Felix stared at the contract marriage agreement at the top of the document, his eyes filled with confusion. Until he saw the signatories were Felix and Georgia, his eyes widened instantly, and he looked at Harley in disbelief. What's going on? How could I not know I signed something like this? I didn't mention the content of the agreement when I had you sign it. Harley paused briefly. Not telling you about this beforehand was for your own good. Felix flipped through the contents of the agreement, then couldn't help trembling all over. Dad, what else have you been hiding from me? Are you saying that my marriage with Georgia was all a sham, and everything she did was out of gratitude, all because she was coerced by you? Mrs. Osmond became agitated upon hearing Felix's words and struggled to look at the contents of the phone. Felix paid no attention to her reaction and instead anxiously looked at Harley, shouting, Dad, speak up. Harley looked somewhat defeated and said helplessly, "Back then, when you proposed to Wendy and she rejected you, you fell into a deep depression. I always knew she was no good, but you couldn't get her out of your mind. Seeing you drown yourself in alcohol every day, I had no choice." At that time, Georgia came to me, begging for an advance on her salary to pay for her mother's medical treatment. Though she was pleading, her gaze was clear, and she carried herself with dignity. That gave me an idea to let her try. If it failed, it would just be some money to save a life, but if it succeeded and you could move on, that would be the best outcome. Felix suddenly remembered that time when he met Georgia. Georgia was unexpectedly transferred by Harley to his department as a secretary. At first, Felix looked down on her somewhat, since Harley had never interfered with a secretary's job assignment before. Felix even suspected she might be Harley's secret lover. But later, Georgia convinced him with her professional competence. Not only do they work together seamlessly, but in daily life, Georgia also takes care of him thoughtfully in every way. Even when people mocked her for wanting to marry into wealth or climb the social ladder, she would just smile and never bother to explain. With her, he always felt relaxed and comfortable. With just a glance from him, she would know exactly what he needed. Felix got somewhat lost in her boundless tolerance, believing she couldn't live without him, that she was utterly devoted to him for life. But now, Harley's words felt like a resounding slap across his face. The pain so intense it left his head spinning, almost as if the world had turned upside down. So, was it all just about repaying a debt of gratitude? Does that mean in George's eyes, being kind to him was merely part of the job? Felix stormed out of the hospital room and hurried toward the exit. However, he had only taken a few steps when a nurse in the hallway called out to him, "Are you Wendy's family member? Your wife has been insisting on seeing you." Felix paused in his tracks, his eyes turning cold, then quickly walked into Wendy's hospital room. Wendy had already learned about the issue with the baby's skin color. Since waking up, she had been crying non-stop and repeatedly calling Felix, but no one ever answered. As for Mrs. Osmond, who had been eagerly awaiting her first grandchild, she never showed up again from start to finish. Felix had barely appeared when Wendy, wiping her tears, hurriedly tried to stand up. The moment she moved, the pain from the wound turned her face pale. At this point, she didn't even need to pretend. Her entire demeanor looked utterly pitiful. Unfortunately, Felix's mind was in complete turmoil at the moment, leaving no room for sympathy toward her. Before Wendy could speak, Felix coldly stated, "I've already informed your parents to come take care of you. They're on their way. As for our marriage, it was never real to begin with. Once you're discharged from the hospital, we'll file for divorce." Wendy froze, her face pale as she stared at him in horror. "Felix, do you really not want me anymore? I know you can't accept the child's skin color, but I'm a victim too. That man not only deceived me, he forced me. I had no choice. If you can't accept it, I can send the child away. Later, I'll give you a child of our own, and we can be a family of 3 together." As soon as Wendy finished speaking, Felix let out a scornful laugh. Wendy had tears still hanging on her face. Momentarily speechless, looking utterly ridiculous, Felix lowered his gaze to the woman on the bed, who appeared pitiful and innocent like a delicate flower, yet was filthy and despicable at heart. He leaned down, then slowly raised his hand, directly gripping Wendy's neck. His fingers tightened, applying pressure. Wendy turned pale and gasped with difficulty. "Felix, what are you doing?" Felix said with a mocking look in his eyes. "Wendy, sometimes I choose to believe these lies of yours. Not because your acting is so convincing, but simply because I want to believe. Do you really think I don't know that in all these years abroad, you've slept with at least 70 or 80 men? Even the night before you returned home, you were with 3 men. Before Felix could finish, Wendy turned deathly pale, her eyes filled with nothing but terror. He had known all along Wendy was tainted, yet, he clung to the beautiful memories, unable to let go. That's why he pretended to be foolish. Wanting to spend a year with Wendy, he never thought about spending a lifetime with Wendy, but because of such a woman, he completely lost Georgia, and now, Wendy dare not cooperate. Felix directly flung Wendy aside, sending her crashing to the ground like a ragged cloth. Wendy burst into tears, sobbing, "Felix, I'll never do it again. You're the only one in my heart. Please give me another chance." Felix kicked her away without hesitation, then said coldly, "Remember to cooperate with me and show up on time to get the divorce certificate. Otherwise, don't blame me for not warning you. My patience isn't what it used to be." With a sinister glance at Wendy, he turned and strode away. Wendy, who had fallen to the ground, suddenly burst into laughter, tears streaming down her face as she laughed. She stared intently into Felix's eyes and shouted, So what if you divorce me? Do you think Georgia will come back to you? She has Patrick now. She doesn't want you anymore, she'll never return to you. What woman, pregnant and forced into divorce by her husband, could ever forgive that? You're delusional, ha ha ha. Felix, without me, you'll never get what you want. Felix halted in his tracks, gave her a vicious glare, then strode away. Wendy's parents, upon hearing Felix's news, were so ashamed of her that they didn't even visit the hospital, instead publicly announcing they were cutting ties with Wendy. Felix drove straight to Georgia and Patrick's doorstep. He stood outside the door for a long time, yet never dared to knock, until the door suddenly opened. Georgia stood at the doorway, looking at him calmly. The servant said you've been standing outside our house for hours. Is there something you need? Felix gazed at the face he had longed for day and night, his eyes filled with nostalgia. No matter how unwilling he was, he had to admit that Georgia, who had left him, looked much healthier overall. Under Patrick's care and adoration, she had become more confident than before, radiant with happiness written all over her face. Looking at himself, he had grown much thinner, with a stubbly beard. The former vigor and high spirits seemed to have been drained away, leaving him looking utterly disheveled and downcast. It turned out that it had always been him who couldn't live without her. Thinking of Harley's agreement, Felix's eyes glistened with tears. He whispered, "If I hadn't brought up the divorce, would you really have never left me on your own, just like what was mentioned in my dad's agreement?" Georgia was taken aback for a moment, then sighed and said, "You know." Felix wished desperately to see a look of confusion on her face, to hear her ask what agreement he was talking about, but her silent acceptance broke his heart. Georgia nodded quickly, yes. Felix silently clenched his fist by his side, his voice filled with sorrow as he asked, "Georgia, did you ever love me?" His voice was soft, afraid to hear her resolute denial of ever having loved him. Georgia looked at him, recalling her past feelings, and the corners of her lips lifted slightly before she slowly replied, "After I learned we were going to have a child, I once imagined a scene where the three of us would live happily together forever. Maybe I loved you, maybe I didn't, but it doesn't matter anymore. My love for you hadn't even had the chance to take root before it was smothered by your favoritism toward Wendy." Felix's lips trembled, his face streaked with tears, utterly heartbroken. Georgia watched his agonized remorse with unshaken calm. "Felix, I used to hate you so much, hated your coldness and indifference, but it was Patrick who taught me what love feels like, and made me realize I should cherish my time, devoting my limited life and attention to those I love, not to hating those I despise. I've found my happiness now, and you should move on too. Once you've made a choice, don't keep regretting it." With that, she didn't glance at Felix again, turning straight to enter the villa. On the couch, Patrick, who had initially been jealous seeing her talk to Felix, but by the end, the corners of his lips couldn't be suppressed no matter how hard he tried. "The one you love." Georgia nestled in his arms, squinting with a sly smile. "Yes, who could it be?" "Seems like a certain Mr. Patrick." Patrick couldn't hold back any longer, pinning her down on the sofa, both domineering and childish. It's me." Outside the door, Felix listened to their laughter, his fists clenching tighter and tighter. "Come out." "He can't come out. He can't just let go so easily." Wendy refused to divorce at all costs, but couldn't withstand Felix's torment and was eventually dragged to finalize the divorce. Felix pulled many strings and finally obtained his divorce certificate on the very day Georgia and Patrick got married. As the wedding time approached, Felix hurriedly drove towards Georgia and Patrick's wedding venue, unnoticed by him. Wendy watched his retreating figure, her eyes filled with a maddening hatred. She muttered under her breath, "Georgia, it's all you. You ruined me, you took everything from me. Why should Felix be so devoted to you, a divorced woman, and yet you're still cherished by Patrick? Why?" She went mad and silently followed Felix's car directly. Felix, afraid of falling behind, drove extremely fast. However, not long after he started, two cars suddenly appeared, attempting to block him. Felix immediately guessed that it must have been arranged by Patrick. His eyes turned sharp. Filled with determination and madness, Patrick had arranged two cars that kept trying to block the way, yet Felix's car sped up faster and faster until, at a turn, it veered off the road. In the distance, a large truck couldn't swerve in time, and the driver, terrified, yanked the steering wheel wildly. Felix realized something was wrong and immediately slammed on the brakes while frantically turning the steering wheel. However, the large truck flipped over due to the sudden braking. Felix, despite reacting incredibly quickly, still couldn't escape completely as the overturned truck came crashing down onto his small car. By the time Felix realized what had happened, his legs were already pinned beneath the truck. His entire body collapsed inside the car. He could only stare helplessly toward the direction of the hotel where Patrick and Georgia were holding their wedding. Wendy's car passed by his vehicle. She glanced briefly but didn't stop. Heading straight for the wedding venue instead, she smoothly slipped into the hotel and changed into a server's uniform. On the stage, Georgia was already exchanging rings with Patrick, pledging their lifelong commitment to each other. Watching Georgia's blissful smile, Wendy's eyes burned with hatred and madness. Die, Georgia, after ruining my life. How dare you be so happy, just die. As she spoke, she tightened her grip on the fruit knife and lunged desperately toward Georgia on the stage. Yet, the moment her body surged forward, her mouth was suddenly covered by someone's hand. The knife she had intended to stab Georgia with was seized by a large hand, its blade twisted and silently drawn across her own neck. Cough, cough. Wendy suddenly widened her eyes in terror, clutching her neck, but the blood gushed uncontrollably. No matter how hard she tried to stop it, she could only feel her life slipping away bit by bit. Wendy looked toward Georgia with deep resentment. But there was nothing she could do anymore. Helpless as others dragged her toward the corner, they entered the hospital one after another. Georgia only learned after the wedding that Felix had gotten into a car accident while trying to crash the ceremony. His legs were crushed by a large truck, and in the end, they had to be amputated to barely save his life. The stroke-stricken Mrs. Osmond cried so much at his bedside that she lost her eyesight. Harley even turned gray overnight. Georgia did not disturb them further and instead, as planned, began her honeymoon with Patrick. It wasn't until the wedding, when she heard Patrick's heartfelt confession, that she realized Patrick was actually the neighbor boy who lived next door to her when she was a child. Back then, Patrick lived alone over there with his nanny and was extremely introverted, while Georgia often took the initiative to play with him. Later, Patrick grew older and was taken back by his family, while Georgia and her mother sold their house to avoid painful memories after her father's death, moving to another city where they bought a small house to rely on each other. Over the years, Patrick had been searching for her but never succeeded. Until the day he attended her wedding with Felix, he thought of 108 ways to steal her away, but fearing her sadness, he hesitated to act. At that time, he thought he would never have the chance to find his girl again in this lifetime. Yet, unexpectedly, how incredibly fortunate, after all the twists and turns, the one by her side was still him.